unconscious dishes of art, not looking anxiously into the future. And only decades later, when roof and walls fell in upon us, did we realize that the foundations had long since been undermined, and that together with the new century, the decline of individual freedom in Europe had begun. Eros Matutinus. During the 8 years of our higher schooling, something had occurred which was of great personal importance to each one of us. 18-year-olds had grown into virile young men of 16, 17, and 18, and nature began to assert its rights. The awakening of puberty appears to be a purely private matter, which each growing person has to fight out in his own fashion, and at first glance does not seem at all suitable for public discussion. As far as we were concerned, that crisis grew beyond its proper sphere. At the same time, it brought about an awakening in another sense. For the first time, it taught us to observe more critically the social world in which we had grown up and its conventions. Children and even young people are at first inclined to adapt themselves respectfully to the laws of their surroundings. But they submit to the conventions demanded of them only so long as they see that these are honestly observed by everyone else. A single untruthfulness on the part of teachers or parents inevitably leads a young person to regard his entire surroundings with a suspicious and therefore a sharper eye. It did not take us long to discover that all those authorities in whom we had previously confided, school, family, and public morals, manifested an astonishing insincerity in this matter of sex. But what is more, they also demanded secrecy and reserve from us in this connection, for they thought differently about these things 30 or 40 years ago than they do now. It is quite possible that there is no sphere of public life in which a series of factors, the emancipation of women, Freudian psychoanalysis, physical culture, the independence of youth, have brought about so complete a change within one generation as in the relationship between the sexes. If we attempt to differentiate between the middle class morality of the 19th century, which was essentially a Victorian morality, and the freer and unaffected views of today, we shall probably come closest if we say that that epoch anxiously evaded the sexual problem out of an inner feeling of uncertainty. Earlier religious ages, that still were honest, and strict Puritanism in particular, made things easier for themselves. Filled with an upright conviction that sensual desire was the sting of the devil, and that bodily lust was unchaste and sinful, the authorities of the Middle Ages approached the problem fairly and squarely with harsh interdictions. And, particularly in Calvinist Geneva, they enforced their strict morality with cruel punishments. Our century, however, being an epoch that no longer believed in the devil and scarcely believed in God, had no heart for so drastic an anathema, but looked upon sexuality as an anarchical and therefore disturbing element, which had no place in its ethics and which was not allowed to see the light of day, because every form of free and extramarital love was in opposition to middle-class decency. In this dilemma, the Times invented a remarkable compromise. It limited its morality, not by forbidding a young man to carry on his vita sexualis, but by demanding of him that this painful matter be attended to in as inconspicuous a manner as possible. If it was not feasible to do away with sexuality, then at least it must not be visible in the world of morality. A silent pact was therefore reached, by which the entire bothersome affair was not mentioned in school, in the family, or in public, and everything which brought its existence to mind was suppressed. It is easy for us, who since the time of Freud know that whoever seeks to suppress the consciousness of natural desires not only fails to remove them, but dangerously displaces them into the subconscious, to laugh at the unenlightenment of that naive technique of concealment. But the 19th century labored under the illusion that all conflicts could be solved by rationalization, and that the more we hid the natural, the more we could temper our lawless powers. Therefore, if young people were not enlightened about the presence of these forces, they would forget their own sexuality. In this illusion of control through ignoring, all authorities were united in a boycott of hermetic silence. School and church, salon and courts, newspapers and books, modes and manners, in principle avoided every mention of the problem, and even science, whose real task should have been to approach all problems impartially, shamefully subscribed to the Naturalia Santurpia. Science also surrendered with the excuse that it was beneath its dignity to handle such improper themes. In paging through books of those times, philosophical, legal, or even medical, we find that they consistently and scrupulously avoided any mention of the subject. When professors of criminal law, in their meetings, discussed more humane methods in prisons and the injurious moral effects of incarceration there, they shyly passed by the main problem. Nor did the nerve specialists, although in many cases they were fully aware of the etiology of some hysterical illnesses, dare to admit how matters really stood. We read in Freud that even his own respected teacher, Charcot, had privately admitted to him that although he knew the true cause, he had never spoken of it in public. But least of all did the so-called belles lettres of the times dare to represent things honestly, for the aesthetically beautiful alone had been apportioned to them as their proper domain. Whereas in earlier centuries a writer had not been afraid to give an honest and inclusive cultural picture of his times, and while in the writings of Defoe, the Abbé Prévost, Fielding, and Retief de la Bretonne once so needed unvarnished descriptions of conditions actually were, or epic thought that it could only portray the sentimental and the sublime, but not the painful and the true. For this reason we find that in the literature of the 19th century, only the merest trace of all the perils, shadows, and confusions of the city view. Even if a writer boldly mentioned prostitution, he thought it necessary to ennoble it, and perfume the heroine as a veritable community. So we are confronted with the amazing fact that in wishing to know how the young of the last century, and even the century before that, fought their way through life, a young man of today picks up the novels of the greatest masters of those times. The works of Dickens and Thackeray, Gottfried Keller and Bjornson, with the exception of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, who being Russian stood outside of European pseudo-idealism, you will find nothing but sublimated and toned-down events described there. For the entire generation was inhibited in its freedom of speech by the pressure of the times. And nothing shows more clearly the almost hysterical overexcitement of the morality of our forefathers and its incredible atmosphere than the fact that even this literary reticence was not sufficient. Is it possible for us to understand that so objective a novel as Madame Bovary was forbidden by a French court as being indecent, or that in the time of my youth Zola's novels were held to be pornographic, and that even so calm and epic a writer as Thomas Hardy had raised storms of indignation in England and America? As reticent as they were, these books had already revealed too much of reality. But we grew up in this sticky, perfumed, sultry, unhealthy atmosphere. This dishonest and unpsychological morality of secrecy and hiding hung over us like a nightmare. And since true literary and culturally historical documents are lacking because of the universality of this technique of concealment, it may not be easy to reconstruct what already has become incomprehensible. A certain clue, however, is available. We need merely look at the fashions or the modes of a century with their trends and visual taste unintentionally also reveal its morals. It is no mere chance that today, in the year 1941, when men and women of society of the year 1900 are shown on the cinema screen in the costumes of their time, audiences in every city and in every village of Europe or America break out into uncontrolled laughter. Even the most naive persons of today laugh at them as caricatures. These strange figures of yesteryear appear as unnaturally, uncomfortably, unhygienically, and unpractically dressed fools. And even to us who still saw our mothers and aunts and friends in these absurd costumes, to say nothing of the fact that we ourselves went about as ridiculously attired, it seems like a ghost-like dream that an entire generation could have submitted itself to such stupid fashions without a move. The male fashions alone, the high, stiff collar, the choker which makes any easy motion impossible, the buttoned-up black frock coats with their flannel skirts, and the high silk hat belts, the top commute, to say nothing of the lady in and out of
Timon, Timon, Timon. Timon.
Must I remind the young people that 30 years ago, with the exception of a few dozen Russian students, every woman in Europe could let her hair down her waist, was curled, brushed, combed, flattened, piled up, with the aid of a legion of hairpins, barrettes, and combs, and with the additional help of a curling iron and curlers, by a hairdresser who called daily, before one could swathe and build her up with petticoats, camisoles, jackets, and bodices like so many layers of onion skin, until the last trace of her womanly and personal figure had fully disappeared. But this nonsense had a secret reason. The true lines of the body of a woman had to be so completely hidden that even her bridegroom at the wedding banquet could not have the faintest idea whether his future life partner was straight or crooked, whether she was fat or lean, short-legged, bow-legged, or long-legged. This moral era by no means regarded as impermissible the building up of the bosom, the hair, or the use of a bustle for reasons of deception or as an adaptation to the common ideal of beauty. The more of a lady a woman was to be, the less was her natural form to be seen. Fundamentally, the mode, with this as its obvious motive, merely obeyed the general moral tendency of the time, whose chief care was dissembling and concealment. But this wise morality completely forgot that if one shuts the front door on the devil, he usually forces an entrance through the chimney or the back door. What catches the more impartial eye of today, looking at these fashions which sought in despair to cover up every trace of naked skin and honest growth, is not their decency, but, on the contrary, their minutely provocative revelation of the radical difference between the sexes. Whereas the young man and young woman of our day, both tall and slim, both beardless and with short hair, have a certain conformity even in their outward appearance, the sexes in those days set themselves as far apart as they could. The men sported long beards, or at least twirled a mighty mustache, so that their manhood was apparent even from afar, while in the case of woman the corset ostentatiously outlined the bosom, the chief characteristic of her sex. The stronger sex was accentuated over the weaker one in the bearing demanded of each, the man vigorous, chivalrous, and aggressive, the woman shy, timid, and on the defensive, the hunter and his prey, instead of their being equal. By this unnatural differentiation in external habits, the inner tension between the poles, the erotic, was necessarily strengthened, and thus, by its unpsychological method of concealment and reticence, the society of that time achieved the directly opposite effect. While in its incessant fear and prudishness, it was constantly tracking down the indecent in all forms of life, literature, art, and dress, in order to avoid every possible incitement. It was actually forced to think constantly of the indecent. Since it searched without interruption for all that was improper, it found itself in a constant state of alert. To the world of that day, decency was always in mortal danger, in every word and in every gesture. Perhaps we can still understand that in those days it would have been a crime for a woman to wear a pair of trousers at play. The possibility of two young people of the same social class, but of different sexes, going on an excursion together without proper supervision was unthinkable, or rather, the first thought would have been that something might happen. Such companionship was only permissible if some chaperone, a mother, or a governess, followed the young people step by step. That even in the hottest summers, young girls should play tennis in clothes that permitted freedom to their legs or with naked arms would have been scandalous. And when a well behaved woman crossed her feet in society, custom found this to be horribly improper because her ankles might be disclosed under the hem of her dress. Even the elements, sun, water, and air, were not permitted to touch the skin of a woman. In the open sea, women made painful progress in heavy suits which covered them from top to toe, and in the boarding schools and convents, the young girls, in order to forget that they had bodies, were forced to bathe in long, white shirts. It is neither legendary nor exaggerated to say that old women died, the lines of whose shoulders or knees no one had ever seen, with the exception of the midwife, their husbands, and the undertaker. Yet after 40 years, all this must appear to be either a fairy tale or humorous exaggeration. But this fear of everything physical and natural dominated the whole people, from the highest to the lowest, with the violence of an actual neurosis. Can one still imagine today that at the turn of the century, when women first ventured to ride a bicycle or rode a man's saddle, these daring creatures were stoned by peasants? Or that once, when I still went to school, the Viennese papers printed columns of discussion about the proposed horribly indecent innovation. The ballerinas of the Imperial Opera were to dance without stockings, or that it was an incomparable sensation when Isadora Duncan, in her highly classical dances, for the first time showed the soles of her feet below her white tunic, which fortunately floated all the way down, instead of wearing the customary silk slippers. And now think of the young people who grew up with eyes wide open in such an era, and how ridiculous these fears over the constant threat to decency must have seemed to them, as soon as they discovered that the cloak of morality, which had been thought to conceal all these things, was threadbare and full of holes. After all, it was unavoidable that one of the 50 gymnasium students would occasionally meet his professor in a dimly lighted back street, or that in the family circle we heard that this one or that one, who was particularly haughty in our presence, had various lapses from grace on his conscience. As a matter of fact, nothing increased controlled our curiosity as much as this crazy business. And since all that is natural is not so much as the man's choice, neither, isn't it? And that this human curiosity created its own unexplained reality. With one hand, previous suppression of taste and early exaltation of there was scarcely a trace or activity of naked smooth in the world. Which really all movements were not quite all which at first read as all natural. And we felt to be so it was unavoidable. We supported gently as we did the necessary impulse to avoid quickly quickly moving on to another. Once we passed the Viennese papers, it became clear that this occasion was one in which all of the various purpose and expression of spirit, concealment and Saturday irreverent sensual freedom, every man expressed equally. This was music. It was all reality, joy, of which all the ideas, all innocent association with the opposite sex was foolishly denied, is 1,000 times more erotically inclined for the younger generation of today with its greater freedom of love. For it is only the forbidden that occupies the senses, only the forbidden excites desire, and the less the eyes manage to see and the ears to hear, the more the mind will dream. The less air, light, and sun were allowed to the body, the more the senses were troubled. To sum up, the pressure of society on our youth, instead of bringing about a higher morality, brought forth nothing but mistrust and bitterness against all authorities. From the very first day of our awakening, we had felt instinctively that this dishonest morality, with its concealment and reticence, wished to take something that rightly belonged to our age away from us. and our will to honesty was sacrificed to a convention which had long since become false. This social morality, which, on the one hand, privately presupposed the existence of sexuality and its natural course, but on the other would not recognize it openly at any price, was doubly deceitful. While it winked one eye at a young man, and even encouraged him with the other to sow his wild oats, as the kindly language of the home put it, in the case of a woman it studiously shut both eyes and acted as if it were blind. That a man could experience desires, and was permitted to experience them, was silently admitted by custom. But to admit frankly that a woman could be subject to similar desires, or that creation for its eternal purposes also required a female polarity, would have transgressed the conception of the sanctity of womanhood. In the pre-Freudian era, therefore, the axiom was agreed upon that a female person could have no physical desires as long as they had not been awakened by man, and that, obviously, was officially permitted only in marriage. But even in those moral times, in Vienna in particular, the air was full of dangerous erotic infection, and a girl of good family had to live in a completely sterilized atmosphere from the day of her birth until the day when she left the altar on her husband's arm. In order to protect young girls, they were not left alone for a